if I go back in my years, I was a child in a Boy Scout group, a Cub Scout, and the old Bay Bell that used to go down to Betterton was docked right down here on the pier. So my first view of Fells Point was at a 11-year-old, 10-year-old,
Okay.
who
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
who would come down here with either the family or the scout troop and take the excursion down to Betterton. And at that time, nobody really called Fells Point Fells Point. It was the foot of Broadway. So the next day, I really got acquainted with Fells Point was when I was first married.
And what year were you first here? I mean, when you call it the foot of Broadway, what
Oh
year
man, that would have been back in 1950, 1948, in that realm.
right after the war.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. And the next acquaintance I had with Fells Point was, it was still the foot of Broadway in my mind, was when I first was married. And they had a barge down here right alongside the pier, right at the foot of Broadway here. Barge, furniture barge, of Scandinavian furniture. And so my wife and I came down here and bought a living room set off the barge, and bought some other things. And that was the first time, because I came back and I was serving a church in East Baltimore, and came back and somebody said, "Well, that's Fells Point." I said, "No, that isn't Fells Point. Fells Point is someplace else." "What do you mean that's Fells Point?" Well, they finally convinced me that that was called Fells Point. And so that was my next adventure with Fells Point. And at the same time, we came down here one night to the Acropolis. It was owned by Nick's family of the Jimmies. And they had belly dancers in a very popular place in the city. Everybody knew the Acropolis and the belly dancers. So that was my next, we came down with friends, acquaintance
Just go ahead.
with Fells Point. And then I served a church in Northwest Baltimore, West Baltimore, and I was there for about 6 years, and my wife left me. So one of the councilmen said, "I know just the thing for you." This guy was something else. He said, "I'm going to pick you up on Thursday night, and I'm going to take you to someplace." I said, "Okay." I was in for anything at that time. And so he brought me down to Fells Point and to Ledbetter's. And every Thursday night, Ledbetter's was just packed. It seemed like they had bars in different sections of the city would have a different night that people would go to. And they would travel to these. Ledbetter's was Thursday night. And you could hardly get into the place. I mean, if you could ease your way in the front door and finally make it halfway back, Ledbetter's, you were lucky. So J.C., that was this councilman's name, that church council, and he introduced me to Fells Point. And here it was at this time that...
What year about?
Oh, 70... That was probably in the fall of 73.
I was just starting
Summer,
my first
fall.
year of college.
Hmm?
I was just starting my first year of college. I was
Don't make him feel
turning 18.
I was
Go ahead, sorry.
30 something, mid-30s. But anyway, so JC and I started to hook up and come down here every week. And it was at this time that I I met a man by the name of Ralph Miller, which I later found out was not his real name, it was his alias. But Ralph was one of the true characters of Fells Point. Probably one of the most intelligent men I've ever known, raw intelligence. But he was the kind of guy that got along with everybody. I mean, and he would get by with stuff. If there's a couple walking down the street, he'd go up, and not knowing this couple, he'd go up and hug and kiss the woman and the couple, and turn to the guy and say, "My gosh, you have good taste," and get by with it. And never, just get by with it. And this is the kind of guy he was. So it turned out that at the church, I really needed to get away after my wife left me, and so I started to pursue a hobby. I made earrings out at the parsonage, and I made about 700 pair of earrings. And I said, well, it's time to leave here, the church. So I came down Fells Point, and I started looking around for buildings to buy. And Fells Point at that time was sort of a risk because the highway was still coming through. And that hadn't been decided upon yet. And but it was still coming through, and all in the path of the highway, Lancaster at Shakespeare, all these houses were condemned and vacant, except for a few that the city had rented to people. So I ended up buying the place on Lancaster Street, and I had 2 apartments in it, and the one apartment had...
Can I ask what the price was at that time?
Huh?
The
Price?
price at that time.
I paid a lot of money for that building for that time. I paid $15,500 for the building. That was considered a good bit of money at that time for that.
Oh yeah.
And but it was not in the lane of the highway. It was been on the right on the edge of the highway coming through. So that was not a condemned property. But anyway, I had 2 tenants in there when I moved in, and one of them was Debbie Swyback. She stayed with me for up until 4 years ago, a year before I had the fire in the building. She stayed in there. And I had another guy in there, and he moved out real fast. And Ralph, then, who had a place out on Moravia Boulevard, and the city was trying to condemn that property, so he moved into that apartment. So, so Ralph and I became real good friends, and I found out a lot about this man and how intelligent he was. He got through junior high school, and that was about it. But he had read all the Greek classics. He had read all the major literary works of Shakespeare and some Chaucer. Extremely intelligent man. He was a carpenter by trade, and he could take a piece of framing for a door, and without taking a measure to it, he eyed up, cut the angle by sight, put that sucker up there, and it would fit. Without any tape, without anything else. The guy was amazing. He worked on also one of the first to work on the Constellation when he came here. He was on that crew. Well, anyway, Ralph was one of the big characters. He was, I had seen him drunk 3 times in one day. It was at one of the Fells Point festivals. He had a wineskin, and he would take that out and do his thing with his wineskin. But he came in about 12 o'clock that day, came through the shop, and drunk, smashed, crawled up the steps into his apartment. An hour later, he came down. Stone sober. I mean, stone sober. And the next thing I know, about 4 hours later, about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, came back smashed again. Crawled upstairs, literally crawled now, up the stairs. He would crawl up the stairs so he wouldn't fall. Came back in an hour, hour and a half, came out again stone sober. 12 o'clock that night, he came back again drunk again. Crawled up the steps, went to bed. 3 times in one day, drunk. Fantastic guy. And
Did he do that often?
Oh yeah, yeah. He got his name. The Ralph, I'm not sure about, but the Miller, because he always drank Miller beer. That's the only thing he would drink was Miller beer, and so he became Ralph Miller. His real name was Ed Lawrence, and so just follow Ralph through here, because he was a major character, one of the first major characters of Fells Point. It was he and Kenny Orey who owned a cat's eye.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenny was a part of the Irish IRA. And he was a gun runner for them. And he used to go on for months at a time, and he claimed he'd be gun running from Europe into Ireland and etc. So he had this real strong connection with that. So Ralph had come up with found someplace, Lord knows where he found it, an old coffin. It was a coffin that must have dated to, it looked very European. It must have dated to the turn of the century.
At the square corners.
Yeah, and it's black and with goldish trim, and it looked very European. So Kenny and Ralph came up with an idea. And this idea became one of the biggest hoax ever played on this city. They came up with the idea that there was a Irish IRA leader in Ireland who died. And in his will, he wished, because of his connections with Kenny, he wished to be buried out of the Cat's Eye pub in Baltimore, in Fells Point. So they wrote up an obituary, sent it to the Sun papers, and the obituary stated when the coffin would be coming in, there would be a procession for him, and he would be laid out in the Cat's Eye pub for a wake. Some papers bought it, and evidently didn't investigate at all. Bought the whole scheme, placed it in the obituary section of the Sun paper, and lo and behold, the liquor board got a hold of it. Called Kenny Orey up on the phone and said, "You cannot have a dead body in a liquor establishment. You cannot do it. We'll close you down." Kenny said, "Well, you're going to have to close me down because we're going to do it." And so the liquor board said, "Well, we'll have somebody there to close you down." Kenny said, "Fine." So on the appointed day, that the body was supposed to arrive here. Here was news people out there, TV, etc., out on Thames Street, waiting for this coffin to come, this procession. There was a pastor, I don't know, a priest there, I don't know where he was from, but they had of course, the bagpipe band, all the way down. So Ralph had placed the coffin at the end of the Broadway pier, and he had an old, I guess it was maybe 14-foot aluminum rowboat. Aluminum rowboats were somewhat popular around but they were very light and they shifted all over the place. So he had somebody rowing that boat. He had the casket across the rowboat, and here was Ralph sitting on top of the casket. The guy rowed him, coming around here, coming into the pier, right down in here. And they almost capsized the boat. And Ralph was drinking his Miller beer, and everybody at that time then knew this thing was all a hoax. But they proceeded with the procession down to Cat's Eye Pond, put the casket in the back room. They had candles all over, and even though most people knew it was a hoax at that time, many didn't. And there were a lot of, especially a lot of young women, would not go back in that room with that dead body. So they opened the casket, and they had a dummy in the casket. But there were a lot of them that didn't go back there. But the biggest hoax played on the city because everybody bought it. And they were all here and found out that it wasn't true.
Did the liquor board actually show up?
Hmm?
Did the liquor board actually show
Yeah,
up?
yeah, they were all here. Everybody was here. Yeah.
How many people? Like just a mob, right?
Yeah, they had a good crowd. You know, I mean, wasn't, I wouldn't say it would be hundreds, you know, but it was a good crowd. But yeah, so that was Ralph, and Kenny would, and now Kenny Orey was another real character in this whole thing. The Cat's Eye, he liked to fight, loved to fight. So
He was Irish.
huh?
He was Irish.
Yeah, loved to fight. So, you know, at 2 o'clock, he wouldn't close the bar, really. He would start a fight. And they would be fighting in there, and the police would come, and the police would come up the door, and they'll say, "Oh, that's just Kenny," and leave. And they'd be brawling in there. And they would go until they tired out. But this was part of Kenny. So Ralph died, I guess it was around in 83. Ralph was a chain smoker. I mean, he just constantly chain smoker, and he died of lung cancer. And so that was the first time that I had one of the eulogy for the characters at Fells Point was Ralph. We had a eulogy for him out in the square. And from then on, I became the person who did eulogies for characters at Fells Point.
But you're already a pastor, so.
Yeah. And so the story with Kenny was, I don't know which I had done. I don't know the order now anymore, but I know Ralph was the first one, and who was the second? I'm not sure. But I did eulogies for Ralph, Harry Reynolds, who that's another story, and Jimmy. But it was one of these I did. And I think it could have been Jimmy, I'm not sure, but it was one of the, afterwards we met right here in Whistling Oyster, and Kenny was sitting right by that window up there at the end of the bar. And I was sitting alongside him, and this was right after the eulogy, and I said, Kenny turned to me and said, well, he says, I hope you realize that I'm going to be the next one you give a eulogy for. Now, Kenny was still young. He was in his 30s. So I said, Kenny, get out of here. Well, you don't want to listen to this stuff. Son of a gun, Kenny was the next one I did the eulogy for. He died of an overdose, cocaine. I think it was cocaine, I'm not sure.
I've seen so many of the pictures talked to a lot of people about him. He was a hard living. He was hard living.
Oh yeah.
I mean, top of the list.
Yeah. But
It's
then
amazing he even made it like that far. I mean, it was just amazing the stuff he
the
did.
guy, yeah.
I think it was Steve Bunker had said, round the clock. He was going at it.
Yeah, he was, and you know, he was hard liver. Ralph was a hard liver. I mean, Ralph was good, and then you had people like Jeff Knapp, who, that was probably the most unique of the eulogies that I was ever, the wakes that I was ever involved in, because probably out of them all, he was probably the most well-known, Jeff Knapp, across the city. He looked like Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't as tall, but he looked like Abraham Lincoln, and he would dress up as Abraham Lincoln. And he was a bartender that attended bar, I think, first up in up in the fish, or one of the classroom, or one of them.
Him too.
And then came down here to Anybody's, and then he tended bar here for a while. He probably most well known for the Cat's Eye, but at his death, somebody had paid for and brought up a New Orleans jazz band, one that did these funerals in New Orleans, the guys with the umbrellas and all this. So he was Jeff was laid out up at Lillian Zoller. So they had a procession from up there. They had a service up there for him, a procession that came down Ann Street with his band. And they came down to the pier, and we had the ceremony out on the eulogy out on the pier. And that was probably one of the most unique of all the eulogies that I did.
How far of a walk was that from?
How far?
Like a mile or?
No, about a quarter of a mile. That's
okay.
Eastern Avenue and Ann Street.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, I don't know what it is to be known as the giver of eulogies or not. I don't know what that has to say about myself.
Well, you do more than. I mean, you still give services out on the pier. I mean, we go to those. And
Yeah.
We still give services.
Yeah, well, that's been a
But
part.
you did Ed Kane's eulogy. He's one of the most famous guys
Yeah.
here.
Mm-hmm. I did Ed Kane. The most recently was Ed Kane and Charlie Newton.
Sorry, I forgot about Charlie Newton.
Yeah, they were the most recent ones that I've done. But back then, when it first came down here, Fells Point was I guess you would call it the best thing that you could call it was a mini Greenwich Village. It was at that time the hippie era. It was sort of towards the end of the hippie
Were you a
era.
hippie?
It was 74.
You kind of a hippie?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, you know.
They just look like a seafarer, but.
Yeah, no, I was. I've always been sort of left of center.
Well, I was going to say left and center.
Yeah. Uh-huh. But the life down here was so different. Everybody knew each other, and if somebody needed something, everybody would pitch in without being asked to do so. It was that community feeling, or that communal feeling down here. I can
Do you think
remember.
that's slipping away?
Oh yeah.
mean,
It's
I mean,
changed.
I try to keep it alive.
It's changed in nature. It's become a little more sophisticated. It's still here to a degree.
There's a few of us. I mean, me and my wife, but I mean, my neighbor Andy, my friend Bill. I mean, there's a bunch of people. We still try to keep that alive.
Yeah,
Of like helping and going to things and, you know, trying to help sponsor something or, you know, with the band I play with, you know, playing it. you know, there needs to be a lot of involvement for because that's one of the reasons I moved here. It just
Yeah.
seemed like there's
No, it's definitely, it
sense of
definitely has
community,
carried
like-
it through.
a sense of community here like nothing else.
Yeah, yeah. It's more community here than probably any place I've ever lived with, except in the black community. The black community, this is the closest I think I experienced between the black community and here, because my church out in West Baltimore was a black church, and the communal feeling there was very strong, and it had to be through history. Black people had to be together and share and support each other. I can remember, this is sort of getting off the story, but just to point it out, I got called out there at 3 o'clock in the morning that one of my parishioners had died. And I went to the house, I dressed and went to the house. I got there about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And lo and behold, I walked up on the steps and the house was filled with people. And they had already brought food. And that's the kind of thing that you had. And that is the kind of feeling and spirit that you had in Fells Point. My biggest concern in Fells Point, out of all this experiences I've had here, is that as the economic level gets higher and higher, a lot of times these people in the higher economic strata will tend to stay to themselves or to communicate or keep a communication with outside areas of same wealth.
Right.
And I'm scared of that here in Fells Point happening with the higher property, new properties with high property values, etc. I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I see it happening in some instances here. But that's my real fear about the future of Fells Point. But back then, I would say it was communal fear, like at Harry's. Harry had the bar down here on Register and Lancaster Street, the place that just says bar. And that place was shambles like, but Harry was a big guy, almost as big as you. He's a big guy. Probably a little
This is going to be
little bigger than you.
This is going to be about the candle.
Huh?
Is this going to be about the candle?
Partially.
See, you think I don't pay attention?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Now, Harry, a big old guy, and he was very sensitive.
As I am.
He was a railroad man, loved the railroad, and he had connections with people all over the city. And one of them was Gordy. Gordy, and I can't think of his last name, but he was a TV cameraman for WJZ. And Gordy, every weekend or Friday night, would come down with a grocery bag full of cheese and mustards and crackers, and there would be a cheese party in Harry's. Everybody, Harry only served beer and wine at that time. That was all it was. But it would be jammed. The place would be jam-packed and nothing to draw except for the fact that this was a place where Harry drew people. And so it became a sort of a local hangout, as well as with Helen's on the corner down here on Thames and Broadway. But
What's Helen's now?
Helen's Bar. That was
Where Admiral Fell is?
no, not the Admiral Fell in the Admiral's Cup.
Oh,
The bar on the
Okay,
corner.
okay.
She lived above it, and she made her money off the tugboat people.
Okay.
But it was a hangout for
Gotcha.
locals. a lot of the theater people went there, or they came over here to the Whistling Oyster later. But you had two theaters down here, the Vagabond Theater and Fells Point Corner Theater. And so, well, the Corner Theater was before the Vagabonds down here. But anyway, Harry, every Christmas I would go down and decorate his bar, and then carry the organ down the Sunday night before Christmas, and we would sing Christmas carols all night. And Harry would get so emotional that tears would come to his face, and he didn't want to see anybody see him crying, so he would leave and go over to Helen's, and then he would come back. And but that's where in the Christmas services Christmas Eve, I have the old candle, big candle, the Fells Point candle, and that's where that originated. That's where I started. The Fells Point candle was in Harry's bar. So that has.
That's still the real candle.
That's still, yeah. It's
So
the original candle.
The one.
And that candle has.
That candle can talk.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It survived that fire. And
It's strange too, the things that, like, your bell survived the fire.
oh, that's another story.
You're like Mr. Fells Point here, one of the few guys. It's like, okay, this is Fells Point. What are we going to have to do to continue that legacy? You know, as you pass down leadership from you to, with all the gentrification going through here, and actually the word gentrification is wrong. I hate to use that word, but
Yeah.
the more money being poured in here, what are we going to have to do to pass that guard down? Because one of the things I like about the community is the fact it does have that preservation. We can sit in a place that was built in the 1700s, and we're talking here, and that's just neat.
Yeah.
All that stuff is neat. I don't want to see a price club move in. I want to see this kind of stuff.
Okay, we're ready to start again.
So that type of question is like, what are we gonna have to do to?
Okay, that wasn't on tape.
No,
that-
but-
yeah. Okay.
Well, I got about half of it on the tape.
Oh,
I need
did
to
you?
have pre-roll.
Okay,
you know.
but the question basically is, first time I saw you, you were this leader guy with people, and you've always preserved Fells Point and its history, and there's a group of you that do that. Two people we've interviewed, Bob Eady, those type of guys. What are we going to have to do to pass that down? Where do you think Fells Point's going? With the new money that's been coming in here, we don't want to see, seeing Timothy's coming in was bad enough, another chain, I don't want that. I think there's a lot of people like me that don't want that either. I want to see places like this survive. We're sitting in a room that's 1700s here. I don't want to make it in LA,
Well, I think step back a little bit. We've been through a lot in Fells Point, and one of the things that has held Fells Point together was that we have always been in a constant battle with the city. This has been both good and bad. It's been cohesive, and it has been somewhat divisive. The divisiveness was for a long time the business community versus the residents, and this was mainly the bars and versus the residents, and both sides had some merit on their what they were saying and standing for. I think one of the positive things that has happened, and one of the things I really have over the years I've been trying to do, is to pull these two factions together, and got a bad name for that with some people. Because I did this, and this was my involvement with the business community and the business association, which I was very involved with for many years. But I'm trying to pull show that the business community and the residents could have a lot in common, and probably did. It was just some, you had extremes on both sides. You had some very badly operated businesses, and then you had some on the residents' side who were just extreme in their nature. This has all now, thank goodness, this is all starting to meld and wane away. There's still a little bit of it left, but in most instances, that's one of the positive things I have seen, is more cooperation between the businesses and the resident. That's a positive. One of the negative things I've seen is the constant gnawing away of the historic fabric of Fells Point. And I think here is where the future of Fells Point can be positive, is that we need to somehow educate those people who are moving into Fells Point the importance of its history. I mean, we have a history here that no other really community, I think, in the country can say we have so much history that we have contributed to the development of this country in such a way, and we don't realize it here. The average resident doesn't know this, doesn't realize how important this is. They don't realize that their building is a part of this fabric that has lived through the battles of North Point and Fort McHenry, and it was in these houses that people lived in that built the ships, the Baltimore Clippers, etc., that really gave the United States the dominance on the seas and during the War of 1812. And the commerce that came out of here. They don't realize that the immigration that happened here, that building has probably been occupied by several different nationalities as waves of immigrants came through Fells Point. And here is where they got their start. And then moved on to communities in East Baltimore and Northeast Baltimore. But they didn't realize that it's so important. And this is our biggest task, I think, is to get people caught up in their history, and then they can become proud of the community they live in. This is a big thing, and I think this history, by getting caught up in this, can then preserve that community feeling in Fells Point, and that's why I started the town crying back. It was the celebration of the ratification of the Constitution. It's back in '87. Anyway, it was a parade that they had from here. It was back at that in that time when the ratification we held a parade that went from Fells Point over to Federal Hill. And this little ship of the Federalists was built for that parade. And they rebuilt that ship, and we had that parade here. And it wasn't any promotion being given to it. So somebody said, well, we need a town crier for this. Maybe, and maybe that use the town crier as a promotional for so the TV station should have somebody to connect to. So some of us had gotten costumes for this parade, these outfits, and so uh, having a loud voice, I was sort of designated to be the town crier, and I did some promotionals for TV stations, etc., for this parade. And but the town crying thing sort of stuck, and I started to give proclamations for visiting groups, and did proclamations for the mayor for a while. Did come some for him, but then I started to do the town crying through the streets at Christmas time. So. That town crying thing also then 2 years ago began.
You do the schooner race too, don't you?
Yeah, there's schooner race every year. I mean, I started out the very first year with the schooner race, and do that. I missed 1 year of doing town crying for the captain's meetings, and that was because of my heart surgery, and I had lost my voice because of the surgery, and that was the only year I didn't do it. But that's a fun one to do because I try to dig up dirt on the people, and so that has become a tradition that if I didn't do that, they would be all over me.
What year did that start?
Started about 11 years ago.
Oh,
The
okay.
first captain's meeting was held in the old Hausner's place down here, Francie's. The first captain's meeting was then there. But anyway, I saw in this town crying thing an opportunity to keep trying to promote the history of Fells Point, keep that alive, and so. I have endowed that program through the Preservation Society, that the town crying program will continue right on through history. And one of the newest parts of that program is a 911 award, and I'm particularly proud of this one because, you know, we have been a community that has been so active. We've had so many people who have given countless hours of their time and get nothing in return, and never get recognized for this. And this is the idea of the 911 award, is to recognize these people every year. And of course, the first one went to Nancy Conrad, who deserves it so much because she was the head of the planning council and established the Citizens on Patrol and has done so much behind the scenes. And she deserved to be the first one to receive that award. But I see that town crying program as hopefully we can expand that program and help to be that educational arm that will help to say to people, we need to be proud of what we have here, and that's part of it. That's a big part of it. A lot that helped Fells Point together were the battles that we had. That's helped to keep the spirit alive. To answer that question that you gave me is I think the thing that we have that is the battle now to keep our history alive. That is the battle I think we're in now. The federal government is going to be helping us out on this somewhat because of the Star Spangled Banner Trail. That is the Park Service National Historic Trail that will celebrate the War of the 1812. And one of the centers, it was two centers of the War of 1812, one in the northern boundary of between Canada, and the other one was the Chesapeake Bay area. They were the two centers of the War of 1812. And we were a vital part of that. And now the national government is recognizing the fact that how important the Chesapeake Bay area was to the winning of the War of 1812. And they have established this historic trail that will include the, Washington, the Bladensburg, the landing points of the British, some of the battles of Eastern Shore, and of course Fort McHenry, and the Battle of North Point and Fells Point. We are a part of that trail, and hopefully this will help us to bring this history alive and to the people here in Fells Point. But we need to educate our people here so that they don't destroy. We don't destroy what we have in Fells Point. We don't destroy such things as this back room here in the Whistling Oyster.
That'd be a criminal act. I mean, it's just unbelievable. That man was around in 1760.
Yeah, I mean, we just, you know, we don't destroy such things as this old brickwork and but that is the battle we're in, and that is, I think, what is going to keep this community alive and together, and this feeling, working together in this battle. So that's where I see it right now as far as the future.
Okay,
goes.
hold on a second. Small break.
We'll take a break.
Yeah.
Small one. How's it going?
Whatever you want to hear next.
I'm not going to tell you what to say.
Huh?
I'm not going to tell you what to
Oh
say.
no, but do you have any categories that you want now that I haven't covered?
No, I think that last speech was just wonderful. Because we keep trying to think of what's the theme for this whole thing, you know, and I think maybe that's like capturing, you know, one of the really big issues.
I think that's where it's got to be. That's why
You're on camera, by the way.
Okay.
You can tell when you're on because the
Okay.
light's there.
But that's why I have devoted my time now to the Preservation Society, working through the Preservation Society, because that's where I think the real future is going to be. And with Ellen in the Preservation Society now, we have a real strong leader, and the promoter of the history, which we didn't have before too much. And but
Can you talk about Ellen's contributions?
Ellen?
Yeah.
I think Ellen's contribution to Fells Point, it's been really great. I'm not saying that the other people didn't have something to contribute. They did in the Preservation Society, but she's turned it around. She's not only a preservationist of the buildings, but she is one who sees the need for this this development of the history, the knowledge of our history. She sees the need for the community to hear about this history, to learn about this history. And she's also an extremely talented person, very knowledgeable. She's a Johnny-come-lately to Fells Point, but very knowledgeable. And perhaps one of her biggest contributions is not only this changing of direction of that society. For a long time, the society was somewhat preserving the buildings, but the big emphasis was the Fells Point Festival. And it was almost, they lived for the Fells Point Festival. Ellen has changed that because her talent is in writing grant proposals. I mean, she cranks out grant proposals like a Cornell style. She's always coming up with other avenues of finding money to develop, and she's an extremely talented person. As I said, extremely concerned about the history here and getting that across to people. So I think we're really blessed to have Ellen.
I know, she's so low key, and when I first started talking to her, it was like...
Yeah, my first adventure was, well,
And then you
wait
look
a
at
minute
all the
now,
things she gets done and all the stuff she puts up with, and
she goes along like she, like she's an outsider, but she's more you get to know her and what she's done, what she's doing, it's fantastic. It's just fantastic. I like to talk with her because she gets uptight, and I like to go around and talk with her so she can unwind and get some of this out of her. And so I think we have that kind of relationship that she can just unwind with me, and that's great.
Who are some other people, if you're like going through a list of awards, what would you give awards to, and what have these people contributed?
Oh gosh, some of the people are no longer here, but I can tell you one. I don't know whether I should do this or not because it may cloud the fact of this 911 award, which I like to try to keep out of my hands as far as who gets the awards. But there are a couple people that I really think are unsung heroes here. And one of them are Charlie and Darcy Norton. They have done so much for this area and behind the scenes. You can't ask for two finer people than Charlie and Darcy. I think they deserve a lot of credit. And I think one has to also look to somebody who everybody knows. You have to look at Ed Kane. Ed was a businessman, and he had been asked to bring his water taxi here early on, but saw it. Fells Point wasn't ready. When Brown's Wharf opened up, he said, I think it's ready for the water taxi service. And Ed came through and he gave a shot in the arm to us here. I know Ed and I, and it was Zippy Lawson the first year. Ed was here, went up to the Pennsylvania bus tour show, and we did tried to get the buses for bus tours to come to Fells Point, and we did that Ed and I did that for the next couple of years, and we dress up and all this kind of thing, but we found out that we didn't have the mechanism here, the staff, in order to follow through with that. But the vision was there, and Ed had vision, and it centered around his business. But he realized that in order for his business to grow, Fells Point had to become more than it was. It had to have something to draw people, and he was constantly after that. And so Ed was one of those people that I think were very very instrumental in our history. I would have to say, in their own way, that the Shields sisters were very instrumental in Fells Point, posthumously. And they had, everybody has negative contributions and positive contributions. They had their negatives, but they had their positives. And I think the positives in the long run outweighed the negatives. I just want, it's just a couple people that I mention right now. There's another one. Mary Rose Wheeler spent so much time, not only with the Preservation Society, but whether you agreed with her or not, that's not important. But she spent so much time in following along with the liquor board and a lot that went on there. She was one of those people that are behind the scenes and never really got the credit I think that she should get. Let me drop it at that.
Okay.
At that point.
You were brought up something else, Kraig, and you didn't get a chance to finish when you first came back here. You were starting to ask PJ something.
No.
I can put you on camera if you don't behave.
No.
Senior moment.
I think, what was it? What was I thinking about?
While he's thinking, here's a. Let me give you a couple interesting stories. I think.
Yeah.
One of the, I do these special services here in Fells Point at Christmas Eve and Easter morning and Thanksgiving, and that all started out of Cammie or Ed called me up one day, or was it Cammie? I don't know, one of the two, and said, "We're getting married. Would you perform the ceremony?" Well, I don't like to. I never really like to get into that marriage ceremony business because if I couldn't do it, it's for one person, and I did it for another, and it was a reason I couldn't do it. There's a lot of hard feelings get created by it. But I said, with Cammie and Ed, I broke down and said, yeah, I didn't have my license from the Lutheran Church at that time, but I had gotten one of these license through the mail order type of thing, and I forget what the outfit is called. It's out of California. But anyway, legally I could marry people. So I said, well, what do you want? I said, you want me in a robe and all that kind of stuff? And he said, yeah. And so I got the robe out, and it's a white robe, and it was yellow from years of, so I bleached it and got it on, and the stole was falling apart, and I sewed that together. And to make a long story short, went over there, did the wedding in the house, and it sort of clicked at that time that maybe I should get back in, and because there's a void in Fells Point, and that's a spiritual void. And that's when I started. The first service I had was the Easter sunrise service, and that was the first service that you came to. And so that's what got me back into it was Ed and Cammy and that wedding. And since then I have gone on, and now I'm reinstated in Lutheran Church, and I have the church out in Ellicott City on a part-time basis. But one of the things that I do want to do, and it's still in my plans and works, is that as I'm redoing this building back here, the greenhouse I had in the back will be turned into a meeting room, and I do hope to do some things with Fells Point along the lines of discussion groups, etc., about the Christianity. And
What about a small church?
yeah, a small church even.
You know, that's another thing too. It seems that's one of the questions I've always had when we started going to services with you. That it took so much spirit back in 1812. If there wasn't that much, the belief in God and country, and we would have lost. And it seems that that's so much dwindled now, that every man is just kind of for himself, and we forget about that.
Well,
forget about God and
yeah, there is a void here, and I know there's and people, I've talked to a lot of people, and my problem has been in trying to get a meeting spot that I could count on, and so I'd said, well, basically, that is why I kept the building, was so that I would have a meeting spot for down here. Or else I would probably sold it. But that was the crowning point in my decision of keeping that building. Was that.
How far are you away from actually making it a reality?
Maybe about a year. And they're
okay.
working on the third floor now. Next would be the second, and the final is the first floor. So it maybe about a year, and so I'm hoping that come to fruition, because the need, I think, is there. And there was something else I wanted to say, and I got on that tangent.
How long have you had a beard?
Hmm?
How long have you had a beard?
How long have I had a beard?
You stopped smoking the pipe, I guess. I haven't seen the pipe. Maybe you still smoke.
I had a beard.
I've
See, I
only
got the
seen you
beard
from
when
the time I
I
met you.
sideburns and a mustache. I grew those when I was out at the church in Augsburg, out in West Baltimore. And the beard came along when I was working at Inner Harbor Lumber. What happened was I had a store, and when they did this,
What year?
oh,
It's like the chronologically, there's some sense to all this.
I would say, let's see, in about 81, 82,
Okay.
somewhere around in there. The story is that when they made the square out here, it took them a year. They had it torn up wall to wall, from the property line to property line. They had torn it up. And what little business I had over here was taken away in my shop, so I closed the shop. Meantime, I had gotten married the second time around. Closed the shop and took on a job at Inner Harbor Lumber as a salesman, and then I became assistant manager, and then they opened a new store up, and I was the manager of that and had to open that. But that's when I grew the beard, during that time.
Because you really have that seafaring thing going on. I mean, that's.
I sort of adopted it. I don't know.
When I first saw you with the Greek fisherman's cap and the thing, and I thought, yeah, hard lads. You can see you getting
The
on
story is, the funny story is, I had the, I took on that look, but I'm really not that crazy about water. I'm more of a mountain person than I am a water person.
You never know. I mean, when I first saw you, I thought, it's going to be some sailing guy, you know, like, "Arr," you know,
Yeah, no, more of a,
under the ship and up we go.
yeah.
Well, I have a little bit an idea. You were starting to talk about all the meetings when they were putting together, I guess it was the urban renewal plan or whatever. For Falls
Yeah,
Point.
that was through the
And
urban
then
renewal.
you kind of dropped it after that, and I was hoping you'd tell us a little bit more about some of the major disagreements within the community. with the
Okay,
issues like that.
yeah, because we had talked about that over in, when we met. Yeah, going back to that time with the Lou Sarah's plan, the thing that was developed out of that was that plan was urban renewal ordinance. The big disappointment, there were several big disappointments. They never got in, and although that Reed and I, every town meeting would stand up and say, we need to do something about arranging for parking. They said, yeah, we'll come to it. And to this, until just very recently, they never really got to the parking situation. But the urban renewal ordinance, the city came through with the urban renewal ordinance that was disastrous. Because in the original urban renewal ordinance, they stated that if you had formstone on your building, that the city could come along and say, we'll give you a year to take that formstone off. If not, we'll condemn the building, take it over, and become the real estate agent and sell that building. Also, most of these buildings here, historically, were 2.5-story buildings. And the fronts and third floor were added on later.
That's what Bob Haney talked about.
And so this urban renewal ordinance said in it that the city could do the same thing. They could come around and say, you got to come down to the original roof line, and we give you a year to do it. If not, we condemn it and take it over and sell it. So there were a couple of us, the Shield sisters, Father Terrence from St. Stan's, who was an assistant minister there, Bob, I can't think of his last name now, and
Keith?
my wife and myself.
Was it Bob Keith?
No, it wasn't Bob Eney. No.
Keith, I mean.
No.
Okay.
So anyway, he was a psychiatrist, this guy. So anyway, we formed a paper committee because to oppose these points in the urban renewal ordinance, because we had elderly people here who, number one, could never afford to do what they said. And they would be kicked out of their homes. And so we fought it. And they were to have the Urban Affairs Committee of City Council was to have their meeting for discussion of this urban renewal ordinance at St. Stan's. So I called up who was then the big talk show host in the city. It was WBAL, Alan Christian. And I called him up one day off the air. Talk shows by that were just really starting at that time, and they were only being on in the evening, not all day long. But anyway, I called him off the air, and I told him the situation, and I read to him what the things. And he said, "Come on, and I'll put you on the air." So it was my wife, myself, and Father Terrence went and talked about what this urban renewal ordinance was all about, and the disastrous effects this could have on a lot of people. And lo and behold, this group of 8 of us, 6 of us, helped to turn out over 800 people in the St. Stan's Auditorium, and we defeated that original urban renewal ordinance. And later on that year, you find out that the city of Baltimore, if you want something passed, without any opposition in city council. You do it during Christmas week, the Christmas week. And so then Mayor Schaefer had a modified urban renewal ordinance passed at city council during that week, Christmas week. But we had defeated those disastrous parts of that urban renewal ordinance. And I'm probably, as far as contributions to Fells Point, I'm probably most proud of that one thing, defeating, because it was so disastrous.
Now, according to Bob Eney, when people bought homes that had been condemned, you know, they had a list of things they had to do as kind of a contract with the city. This urban renewal ordinance would have affected more properties than just that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, the urban renewal ordinance would have affected not just those condemned properties for the road. It was any property in the historic area, the urban renewal area, which went up to, I think, up to Bank Street, south part of Bank Street, and Caroline Street and Washington Street. So, no, it affected any of these places in here. There was a hole in the donut, which was centered around St. Stan's, that was not included. And today we're living with the threat of what's going to happen then to St. Stan's.
Now, what is Yatton with St. Stan's? Is it anybody there?
Nobody's there. No.
Who's keeping the building up? Is it Catholic?
Well, the Catholic Church,
Charities,
the Franciscans still own the property. Now, I heard, a lot in the community, and Nancy's been a part of this, Conrad, been trying to save that building as a museum.
Yeah, that's neat.
So, but I heard that the Franciscans denied their request, but I'm not sure. I can't be sure.
Parking was very emotional, and I don't quite understand exactly why. I mean, I know that there was live free or park free or die stickers, and
oh, okay, that was
a big rift between.
That was one of the side effects of that kept this thing, this controversy with the bars and the homeowners, because the homeowners were being crowded out of parking their cars because of the nighttime bars, traffic. And so they came up with becoming a part of this permit parking. Well, then the business community say, hey, you can't do this. This is, it's going to hurt us. So we got into that point of contention, and that just fueled the battles between really the bars and the residents. And that permit parking thing was more of a fuel thing. It wasn't. If there hadn't been the contention before, I don't know if it would have become as big of a point of contention as it was. But the contentions were that these bars became too noisy. Here you had bars in old buildings. And there may be residents alongside them or close to them. And these old buildings were not built to contain sound. So with the new sound equipment that was coming, that came in, you just blast the residents way off. And some of these, I know I had the problem with the Max's when they had live bands. You couldn't sleep at night, but it was all because of the technology and the sound, etc. But also, you had bars that were catering to college kids and even younger. And the first one of these was Surfside Sally's. And it was Surfside Sally's that changed, that really changed the bar scene down here. For instance, a Whistling Oyster used to be mainly older folks that would come here. And when Surfside Sally's came, then they drove these people away because the older people didn't want to be associated with the rowdyism of this younger crew. It hurt the nighttime businesses of retail. I know I used to, when I reopened a shop in '86, I used to do, for instance, at Christmas, on the weekends, I would stay open to 12 o'clock at night, and the shop would be filled with customers. I mean, 20, 30 people up until 12 o'clock at night on the weekends.
Were these
And
the
then-
college kids, the older people? Or?
These are older people, middle-aged older people that would come. We had the Candlelight Christmas program, which we haven't talked about, but that was created. I experimented with my first year. I had the shop open the second time around, and I experimented with late time shopping in that year, and decided the next year. I got some of the businesses together, and I said, look, this is what we can do, and this is what happens. My experiences, and we created the Candlelight Christmas that went on for 7 or 8 years until I couldn't do it anymore. It was after my surgery that I had to drop it out of it. And, but that Candlelight Christmas was 4 weekends in a row. We had horse and carriages in the streets that gave rides, and I wonder if you remember them. But it used to draw tremendously. And we were really getting the thing rolling, and it takes years to develop a program like that because you get on people's schedules and calendars, etc. And we were really getting it rolling. And then Surfside Sally's came in, and all of a sudden, people started that program started to dwindle off the table because people didn't want to be associated with that rowdyism. They didn't want to come down here and have that happen. And then you had Tina and Tony's wedding, Tony and Tina's wedding, and Perloff had bought into that, and they opened up the sanctuary, and then that started to feed off of Surfside Sally's, and you had that, and then Surfside Sally's we were able to get closed, and that was a big fight, and that fight was joined by some of the bar owners here, and that was the first time that has ever happened, that the business community started to fight some of that irresponsibility of bar owners. And we saw it after Sanctuary, then 723 came, and we all know what happened there, and how the actual bars testified at that hearing against 723. And so you saw this melding of people, of bars and community coming together. But it was that nighttime rowdy group that urinated in people's mail slots and into their homes and walked on top of cars and broke windows and pulled up flowers out of pots and took pots and threw them in the street, and it was this kind of thing that got the bars and the residents on odds, because the bar says, well, we're not responsible for that, and the resident says, well, who is then? And it was that kind of thing going back and forth.
Now currently the business owners are complaining that business has been really slow, and even the bar owners are saying that that what do you have any perspective on business
Yeah,
in Fells
yeah.
Point and why?
Okay, two things happened, and this is my perspective on that. The same time you had these kiddie bars come in, you also had in the city or in the metropolitan area the hijacking of cars. I don't know if you remember that. You had a rash of cars that were being with people in them, you know, hijacked, carjacks, and the explosion of murders in the city got a lot of publicity. So you had two things, and you had the other thing is parking. You had the kiddie bars down here that people didn't want to associate with. Then you had the fact that the bar traffic was taking up the parking spots, so nobody could come down here and really shop with ease. And then you had this negative perception of the city. We are in the city. People, in order to get here from the outlying sections, have to come through the city to get here. And they were scared and afraid. And as I saw my traffic dwindle in my shop, I asked questions to the customers that would come in and say, you know why? And they would say, people are scared to come into the city. So it was a combination of things that happened together. But I think the biggest thing was that Baltimore City got the reputation across the nation. This was not just local, across the nation, of being an unsafe place. And my shop used to draw from the whole metropolitan area, the whole middle Atlantic coast, and even drew as far as Nova Scotia, because there was an article about my shop in was it Nova Scotia? No, Iceland.
Wow.
So it got an article in the Icelandic paper about the angels, and if people from Iceland would come to the Mid-Atlantic area, mainly to go to Washington, etc., they would come to Baltimore to shop in the shop. But then this thing spread about Baltimore, and Baltimore is still under that cloud, very much under that cloud. You get there was on the news last night, etc., past couple of days about downtown partnership and panhandling. Well, it's that fear factor that people have, and it's going to take years to try to overcome this now. And I think we can overcome it again.
It's almost like TV viewership. Once a person turns the channel, they're never going to go back to that channel.
You've got to start all over again.
Once they decide they're not going to come down to the city, they correct and they're going to go someplace else.
Yeah, and you got to start all over again to ruin them. And again, I hate to say there's a cure-all, but I turn back, I think a partial answer to this whole thing is this history business. I think that if we can get people involved and the businesses involved in the history, then I think we may be able to lure some people back, because we'll become unique, we'll become different. What's the sense in coming to Fells Point when you can shop out in some mall or whatever, or Walmart or something? We got to become that unique spot, and our history can give us that uniqueness. And our shops and businesses and restaurants have to take up on this. I think if the business community here is to be successful, it's got to become aware of this history and the importance of this can play. The number one tourist attraction across the country, number one tourist attractions are historic spots. Number one. It far exceeds seashores, far exceeds anything else. Historic spots. And we got to realize this. And the business community, I haven't gotten a real late sense on it, but Ellen's gotten involved a little bit with the business community and the business association. But we got to pick up on that.
Can I go back and fill in a couple of
Yeah.
places? I have the impression that during and after the road battle, there was a group of people that bought properties, were interested in historic preservation, were interested in improving their properties.
Yeah,
had at least some money to put into them, some more than others.
Yeah.
And then there was the long-term resident in the community, and it sounds like there was a lot of divisiveness between those two groups. Can you give me some reasons for that?
Yeah, originally it was a lot of divisiveness, and it was, I think on the one side of the older residents, it was some type of a fear of losing what they had. And with the new residents, and I'm afraid that first urban renewal ordinance was tied to some of those new residents. The thing of tearing down the formstone and the third floor, etc. This was tied to that, and that group was called ORA, Owners Restoring, whatever association. But there was ORA, and then there was the Fells Point Improvement Association. And the Fells Point Improvement Association was the older residents, or was the newer coming in, restoring. And we got off to a bad start. And the bad start was during that whole thing of the loose hours plan, the town meetings, etc. The older people thought they were being ramrodded by the newer ones coming in. And when that urban renewal ordinance thing came, that was just disastrous. And then there was a lot of finger pointing and going on. And the battles at the residents, the battles at those town meetings town hall meetings were just notorious, and there was old residents against new residents. The old residents didn't really understand. They thought they were being kicked out of the community. And the newer residents didn't do anything to assure them that they weren't being kicked out. And so that became, it was a lot of perception that was going on. I perceive that you don't want me, or I perceive this, or I perceive that. And that feeds on itself. And then you had some people who came in for their own political advantages who festered on that and ate upon it. And I won't mention any names, but they just fed on that and kept that going and kept that festering. And instead of bringing together a healing process, they kept it for their own good or own egos or whatever. I don't know, but they needed that contention in it, and they kept it going live and just.
Okay, I'm going to change the subject totally again.
Yeah.
This was, in recent, the first part of the 1900s, was a fairly lower class community, such that, you know, the city thought it was totally expendable to put a road through.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed is there was the Allied Chemical site that was, some people call it a Superfund site, although I don't know if it technically was. There's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of area along Caroline that people talk about as a brownfield.
Yeah.
I know a guy that was the environmental manager of the P&G soap plant, and he talks about spills and things, and, you know, of course, Fells Point would have been a victim of some of those things. And, you know, it was a very much, I mean, now you have the shops and you have bars and things and you have people, residents, but then it was industry plus, you know, bars and shops and people. Can you tell me, I mean, did people notice any of that?
No, they didn't. They really didn't, because a lot of the people here in the 20th century, they were later immigrants, the Polish community, but this was their livelihood. You know, they earned their money off that waterfront or that industry or whatever, or that cannery in the early part of the 20th century, late 1800s. But that was their living. You know, there were some
That's
people.
before also the knowledge of cancer and
Yeah,
chemicals.
we didn't know it. They didn't know what, you know, what caused cancer and the whole thing. Later on, we found out that we had so many cancer deaths in Fells Point. It was way out of proportion to the national average.
Even more than Baltimore?
Yeah, it was high in the cancer rate here.
What happened? I mean, that awareness started to filter out. I mean, was there any public discussion of it? How
No,
did people
not really.
feel?
No. The environmental thing wasn't really too big at all. You didn't get that. It wasn't a concern of the older residents, and
The newer ones.
the newer ones, it was somewhat more of a concern. But they moved in here and they sort of accepted it.
And then when the Allied site was closed down, what was the reaction?
It wasn't much of a reaction about it, the Allied site, except that, then it became aware, people really became aware how contaminated that spot was. And the Allied people, to their credit, kept coming to all the community meetings, telling them their progress on their cleanup, and that helped out a lot by them reassuring the people what they were doing there and how they were cleaning the spot up. So, to their credit, Allied Signal did one terrific job in keeping the community informed.
Okay.
It was a very, but generally in the old community, the people, that was their livelihood. I mean, all this that was around. The communal feeling in Fells Point back in that time was something to behold. I'll never forget it. I remember this place that we're in right now, Whistling Oyster, this back room. The building was in bad shape when Reed and Robin bought it, and so they had to do a lot of work in it. But they were slow in doing it, and so Ralph would come over and just donate his time and help out. But it became around Thanksgiving time. It was Thanksgiving week. And I don't know whether it was Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving Day or when it was. But this back room was torn up. The only piece of flooring was right in this back area here. As you came into the room, the floor was torn up. But got a hold of a turkey, and Ralph liked to cook over open fires, so he cooked the turkey in this fireplace. And it was maybe about 10 or 12 of us came for the Thanksgiving dinner here, and I'll never forget that. It was everybody came together. It was almost like a spontaneous thing, and it was the family in Fells Point, and Fells Point really became a family to us. So that was a really one of those unique Thanksgivings that I'll never forget. In the middle of desolation almost back here, it was a fantastic experience. But I had to shop over there, and I sold earrings that I made, and I started to make candles. I made mobiles, and so the first shop over there, PJ's Place, that's what it was. I would sit there and make stuff, and people would come in, and sometimes they would buy. It was not that many bought, but it was an interesting experience in the shop. But at that time, everything wasn't so hunky-dory, though. We got into, the city decided they needed, after the expressway was defeated, the city decided that they needed a master plan for Fells Point. So a planning council was set up here in Fells Point of residents and business owners, and the people, they established block groups meetings in each of the blocks in the what was designated historic Fells Point, and it was probably the most meetings that a community had ever had. They would have these block meetings, and the input would go into the planning council, and then they would have these town meetings at the old Mission Society over here. And these town meetings were some of the most, I don't know, I never have really experienced such dissension and discord as those meetings. I mean, people would get up, and it was almost to fisticuffs every meeting. I mean, people shouting at each other, spitting at each other. It was, and they'd be packed. These meetings would be packed. I can remember one of the big meetings we had was over St. Stan's, and it was one of the community people got so angry that there was a Howard American Legion Post had a girls twirling group, and they had won all these trophies, and so they brought these trophies over and set them on a table to show the community. They were proud of this. So this guy got so angry, he came up, upset the table, broke the trophies, and had to call the police to get him calmed down and get him out of there. But it was that kind of thing, and it was the tension was between trying to make this an upscale neighborhood over and against the elderly people who were still here. I can remember, and it was also the fact of trying to preserve the history of Fells Point, the buildings and whatever. And I don't know whether the Shield sisters have come up or not. But the Shield sisters were very much part of this whole thing in this planning council era. The Shield sisters have bought up a lot of properties, and their vision was to make a living museum out of these properties. They bought different types of properties: a working man's property, one that would have been a mansion, one that would have been a workplace. But the DeShield sisters, who are actually the descendants of Captain DeShields that operated out of Fells Point in the early 1800s, they didn't have the money to really pull this off. They took bad advice and finally ended up in bankruptcy. But they were really neat people. A lot of people have talked against them, etc. They had their eccentric ideas, but their heart was in the right place, but they just didn't quite know how to pull it off. Some of their legacy is still up here on Alisana Street in the old State Bar, but they had tons and tons of stuff, records and historic items, and a lot of them have been lost now and gone. They had a mansion on Eastern Shore and a place up in Sparks, and all these places here. But the DeShield sisters were a vital part of that planning council era, and they were the ones. Eleanor DeShields was a stickler. These curbstones. It's curbstones out here in the square, etc. Had the original markings, numbers for the market stalls. Well, they insisted that when they tore all this up in here, that those curbstones be placed back. And that's why we still have some of the original curbstones out here, was because of the DeShield sisters.